right. We are going to be in Acts today. How many of you have ever taken a personality test? Have you ever heard of a personality test before? So if you're interested, there are good ones online that are free that you can take. But these tests are used by psychologists to help clarify mental issues. So I'm really kind of glad that not many of you raised your hand when you said, yeah, that you've had some of these tests. But they're also used by employers. And employers will use them to determine how a prospective candidate will react in a certain situation. Like if there's high stress at the job, they want to know how you're going to respond when you're in a stressful situation, and these tests help them determine that. And also, it will help them, so I'll give you an example. If you're applying for a sales position, so who's better qualified for a sales position, or who's going to fit better in a sales position? Would it be an extrovert or an introvert? Someone who likes to work with people and who is comfortable talking around people and in a high pressure situation? Or is it maybe an introvert who likes to work quietly on their own and not really happy or doesn't enjoy speaking with a lot of people? So that's the kind of thing that these personality tests can help. And they also indicate how easily individuals deal with conflict. Does anybody here have any conflict in your life? Have you ever had a disagreement with someone? Yeah, I see some hands, absolutely. So we're going to explore a biblical occasion, an encounter when two Christians disagreed and how they worked through it and what we can learn from it and apply to our life today, our Christian walk today. And it's actually between Paul and Barnabas. And we find this in Acts 15, verses 36 through 41. Hear the word of the Lord. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Thanks be to God for the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his holy word. So let's dig a little bit deeper and find out what's going on. So the book of Acts is, many of us, as you may know, consider it to be the birth of the church, right? So this is the disciples carrying the gospel message to the Jewish communities that they were living in, and then going out and pressing outward into the Gentile areas. So Paul and Barnabas had gone on their first missionary journey. And Mark, they calls him John Mark, but it's Mark that wrote the book of Mark, started out on the journey together. So they were together, and Mark, something happened and Mark left, okay? And so we're going to talk about that specifically a little bit later, but I want to explain to you what has happened in chapter 15 before we started reading our verses. So in the beginning of chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch, and the men there they had really strong feelings about Gentiles needing to be circumcised. And, Paul and Barnabas were trying to tell them that, no, we don't want to prohibit the Gentiles from worshiping the Lord. They're still true believers without being circumcised. So why did these men have such a time with this issue? Why did they believe that circumcision was necessary? Well, when we stop and think about it, the law, the Old Testament required it. That was one of the things that was required when a baby was so many days old. They took him to the temple and they got him circumcised. That was in the law. And so it was a long-standing tradition. It was very difficult for these individuals to change their thinking, change their hearts, and change their thinking about this very important topic of circumcision. So, they said, we want this to be resolved. So go back to our leaders in Jerusalem and get us an answer. We want to know one way or the other whether it's required or it's not. So Barnabas and Paul went back to Jerusalem, talked to the believing leaders there, the Christian leaders there, and they determined that it was not necessary for the Gentiles to be circumcised. So Paul and Barnabas went back to Antioch and delivered the news. And while they were there, they decided that they would stay and preach and teach a little bit longer. And then that's where we started our verses after some time had passed. So after they had been there for a period of time teaching and preaching, Paul says, hey, let's go back to those churches that we established, those believers that we visited during our first journey. Let's go back and see how they're doing, and let's really encourage them and build their faith, make their faith a little stronger by going back and finding out what's happening and seeing how we can be of service. If they need some assistance, if they're not understanding something correctly, we'll be glad, we'll be available. And Barnabas said, hey, that's a great idea. Let's take John Mark. Whoa, Paul said, no, we're not going to take Mark with us. So that was the conflict that they had. That was the disagreement that they had. So it is an opinion. They had a disagreement about an opinion, their opinions. And it's interesting to me because they both are stating the facts. Mark went with us before, Mark left us, and Barnabas, that's what Paul was saying. He was with us, he left us. See, they were being persecuted, and it was very difficult to be a missionary. It's not easy being a missionary today in our country, the countries around the world. It's a very difficult job. There's a different culture, there's a different language, there's different laws. It's very stressful to be a missionary. Well, Mark may have been very young in his spiritual journey. And so we're not going to be too hard on Mark, but Paul said, no, either he's not ready or there was something else there that Paul said it's not wise to take him with us. And Barnabas, here he is the encourager, and he's saying, but I serve a God of second chances. So Paul was stating the facts, Barnabas was stating the facts, and they just had a differing opinion about this. So it's important for us to recognize that they didn't have a differing opinion about the basic foundation of our faith. So it wasn't an issue of, well, I don't believe that Jesus was resurrected. I don't believe that he rose from the dead. That's not what they're talking about. Sometimes we have to take very hard stands when we're talking about those type of foundational beliefs. But today, in our example today, it's about an opinion. And both of them appear to be correct. Both of them appear to be right in their perspective. But we all have different perspectives. And to really appreciate this difference of opinion, let's talk about being vaccinated. Oh, boy, it's a topic that comes up every day in my workplace. We have those individuals, it's their opinion that everybody needs to be vaccinated. And then we have other people over here that say, nope, it's not necessary. So they both believe very strongly it is their opinion, and it sometimes causes a conflict because it's difficult to resolve, okay? But we're going to talk about how Christians should be resolving our conflicts. So these are some things that we can do and some things that we can avoid that'll make the process a little easier. So the first thing that we need to do is recognize that we're not always going to agree. As Christians, we're still human. We're not always going to see things from the same perspective. We have different backgrounds, we have different experiences, we have different perceptions. So we need to remember to stay with the facts, state the facts. I don't know about your world, but I have heard time and time again where women, when we but when we have disagreements, we like to bring things up that happened 20 years ago. And we'll bring it right back up to the present and fight about it all over again, especially if we seem to be losing the argument. But we want to do our best to stay focused on the topic at hand and not go backwards and dredge up old disagreements. So we want to stay in the present, and we want to be factual and don't allow our emotions to overtake. Don't make things up and don't embellish the story. Stick with the facts. It's important to strive to find a resolution that will be pleasing to God and not destroy their purpose. So their purpose is to spread the gospel, right? So they have to figure out how they're going to do this in resolving this conflict. The second thing that is very encouraging to me is that Paul and Barnabas did not drag the church into their disagreement. They didn't reach out and call people on the phone and say, I need you to take a side. This is how I see it. Are you with me? No, we don't want to do that. If you have a disagreement with someone, you need to try to resolve it with that individual and share those details only with that individual or those who need to know. There is so much drama in our world and most of our lives. We don't need the extra drama. But if you need assistance in resolving something, that's a different story. But you've got to make a good effort to resolve it on your own. One thing that we tend to do is we tend to complain. Oh my goodness, do you see this blue carpeting? I voted that we get green carpeting at the board meeting, but they overrode me. It shows all the dirt. We really should have had the color that I picked. That is complaining. And what does that do? That tends to keep the disagreement alive, and it tends that people are going to avoid you. You know, when you're just constantly complaining about this disagreement and this conflict, people are going to avoid you. They don't want to listen to the story one more time. And another thing that we shouldn't do is we shouldn't lash out at the individual who you are having the conflict with. Lashing out gives the enemy temporary control of your tongue. And what can happen when you're disagreeing with someone and you're trying to keep your emotions in check and the enemy gets a hold of your tongue and you can say hurtful things quicker than you can think them. And they're out of your mouth. You've done the damage. So when we do that, we're not acting in a manner that honors Christ. So we don't want to lash out at another. We also want to try to work it out. We want to give our best effort to work it out. Explain your point of view and why you feel the way you do. Some folks tend to clam up, turn around, stomp off. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever tried to resolve a disagreement with somebody who gets all grumpy? Close up and turn around and walk out. Well, what's that going to solve? That's not going to solve anything. So do your best to open up those communication lines and explain your point of view. And while the other person is explaining their point of view to you, make sure that you're listening. You're listening to understand, not listening to respond, because your mind can still be going and like, I'm going to be right, I'm right, and this person needs to understand that I'm right. No, you need to listen to what they are telling you and try to work it out. You're not trying to be right, you're trying to resolve the issue. And then, if at all possible, consider overlooking the issue. When it's a matter of opinion, try to overlook it if you can. The second greatest commandment is to what? Love your neighbor. Sometimes, for the sake of that other person, it's okay to choose to let it go. It's okay to choose to take the high road. Because why? Because Jesus knows your motives. He knows what's in your heart. And he will reward you in some way at some point for taking the high road. Whether it just be that peace that passes all understanding, he'll give it to you for making a choice to let it go. And then move forward. Don't remain there. Don't get bitter. Don't get angry. Try to move forward. God has given you a purpose, and you need to be moving on. Don't let the enemy stump you and get stalled out because of this disagreement. There are men and women who don't come back to church because of the disagreements that they have had, and not so much the disagreement that they had, but the way that it was resolved or not resolved. How many of us would just rather dig a hole and put our head in it and avoid it altogether? There are those personality types that do want to avoid conflict when at all possible. And sometimes that's just not possible, and then it does need to be addressed. So your goal is to find a resolution that you can both live with and move on. Don't be ugly about it, and don't hold a grudge. And then because we are united through the blood of Christ, sometimes that bond is all the reason that we need to resolve the issues quickly and quietly. Even when we feel like we're being treated unfairly, let it go. Jesus sees it. Jesus knows what you're doing, that you're placing someone else's welfare above your own. It is not always necessary to be right for the sake of being right. especially when it comes to opinions. So, in closing, I want to leave you with two scriptures, one in Romans and one in Ephesians. So Romans 12:18 says this, "If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all." Let me read that again. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Who's in control there? So far as it depends on you. So you have some control in this situation. You have some control. So choose wisely. Choose to live peaceably with all. And then Ephesians 4:32 says this, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you." Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. So later on in Paul's writing, now we're talking probably maybe 10 to 14 years later, God does a wonderful thing and he reunites Paul, Mark, and Barnabas. And you will see the three places that I found it was in Galatians, 1 Peter, and 2 Timothy. There's probably other areas, but these were the three that I found, where Paul is requesting that these saints, these leaders, be sent to him because they offer him encouragement, and they were wonderful brothers in the cause for Christ. So God takes our conflicts, and in his time, things work out for our good, right? He works them out for our good. So the damage that was done, and I'm sure there were feelings because what? Barnabas went one way and Paul went another. I'm sure there were some hurt feelings there, even though, it was resolved. But here we see later where Paul was requesting them. He loved them and he wanted them to be part of his efforts. So as a Christian dealing with conflict, it matters less about our personality type than our desire to resolve conflict in a Christ-like manner. Don't lose your Christian witness because you want to be right. And that's what it comes down to sometimes, is just the pride inside of us. We know we're right and we want to be right. No, we need to resolve the conflict in a Christ-like manner. So the best rule to follow when we are faced with disagreements is not to seek glory for ourselves and to puff ourselves up, but to glorify God in all of our words, in all of our actions. Amen.